Hey, everybody, it's Standing for Truth. As you know, we've debunked a lot of evolutionists on this channel. We've also addressed and refuted all the top evolutionist arguments. Today, we are debunking Herman Mays, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Enjoy, guys. And for those who enjoy this channel and would love to support us financially, please feel free to hit that donate link. We'd greatly appreciate it. God bless.
They showed how common ancestry predicts a hierarchical structure between variant sites. So that's what you would predict based on common ancestry, is these variant sites that vary, should vary hierarchically. They should be groups within groups, basically. Single ancestry for each family predicts that sites will have no hierarchy and vary independent of one another. So there's a statistical test they do to see how hierarchical the data set actually is. And here's the difference between those data. So here the black data is the simulated data if creation was true, if there were separate ancestries for each lineage, and then the gray part's the actual data. The p-value associated with this difference is essentially 0, meaning there's virtually no chance there's a worse fit between the actual data and the expectations based on single ancestry. So again, you can rule out single ancestry. So here we go. Here's common ancestry or common design. Again, we have two models, a common creation event versus common ancestry. Here we have a whale, a cow, a manatee, and a shark. Okay, so here's our two models that we have here. Common design, you might be able to invoke a common design thing, but you would expect that common design would place the whale, the shark, and the manatee on the same branch because they're all designed for the same lifestyle. They live in water. Whereas common ancestry might not place animals with similar lifestyles on the same branch necessarily because they can have different common ancestors. That common design tree is not what we see in the data. And we do see a common ancestry data there.
Dr. Herman Mays here attempts to argue that these nested hierarchies found in DNA, the same would also prove true for anatomical nested hierarchies, any form of nested hierarchies for that matter. Now, he argues that these hierarchies are only evidence for evolution and universal common ancestry, and this alone. This is where his mistake lies. He is asserting that function cannot be used to explain them. He rejects created heterozygosity and therefore sees no other way to explain the hierarchies. In fact, his statement of non-function is an assumption, not an empirical fact. There exists an abundant amount of literature that suggests that these third codon positions are indeed functional. And as a general rule, we can then predict function for these third positions, depending on which species were compared, whether they're the part of the same kind or not, etc. Now, hierarchies in general, they can be found at all levels in both the creation model and the evolution model. This evidence of nested hierarchies are agnostic to the debate. We can even find hierarchies on all levels in the design. Sedans and hatchbacks, of course, or sedans and SUVs will share hierarchies since these modes of transportation are all incredibly similar, but we could even incorporate something as distant to a sedan as, say, an airplane. This example can be compared to, say, humans and birds, which according to our model are different kinds. Even these very different animals will share hierarchies just like the sedans and the airplanes. When we focus our attention to materials used, for example, the types of metals, or we could even examine the types of tires used on both airplanes and sedans, what do we discover? We discover nested hierarchies. Therefore, these hierarchies are characteristics of design and not ancestry. I mean, think about it. Humans, pigs, rats, and ducks can share nested hierarchies. For example, they are all land dwelling. Even though, according to our model, they are separate kinds, but since they are all land dwelling and share many amount of other features, they can share similar nested hierarchies or design. As I've stated before, nested hierarchies in DNA, which is exactly what Dr. Mays is looking at here, are also predicted by creationists based on the design model. Now, because we look to function as a tool to differentiate between the evolutionary model and the creation model when it comes to DNA level nested hierarchies, Dr. Mays shows here just how superficial he can be in his approach to the creation model. Now, he suggests that our model, based on design, would predict certain animals to fall in the same grouping. Here, Dr. Mays believes that the creation model predicts whales and sharks should be part of one biological grouping, and then land mammals as part of another biological grouping. Now, this is because, as we know, whales are classified as mammals and not fish. Therefore, Dr. Mays thought that this refutes and falsifies our biblical creation model. But Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, in his rebuttal to Herman Mays, puts it perfectly. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen states, Linnaeus grouped whales with mammals, not fish. As a creationist, why would Linnaeus do this? Linnaeus based his classification on function. Superficially, since whales and fish live in the water, you might be tempted to group them together. However, despite their superficial outward similarity, they strongly diverge at the physiological levels. As I've said at the beginning of this part, Dr. Mays has taken a very superficial approach to our model. When it comes back to function, just to cover and go over the fact that we understand so very little of the DNA language. And much of Dr. Mays' approach and much of his arguments has to do with neutral variation or junk DNA, for example. But the fact is, junk DNA has been completely overturned, and we understand very little of the DNA language. So much of the claims made by evolutionists in regards to DNA and DNA function and junk DNA has been overturned. Pseudogenes, for example, they're now known to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes. Endogenous retroviruses have been overturned. They are now known to have functional roles, for example, in the placenta and in the embryo, among other important roles. And then they try and say that these roles and these functions have been co-opted, nothing more than a rescue device with no real evidence, no real testable predictions. We have really just begun to discover just how amazingly functional the human genome is. Just to think about how many experiments would actually need to be done to conclude with any real level of surety that a particular set of, say, DNA sequences actually has no function. And we know that we have preliminary biochemical evidence for function based on ENCODE. And this also goes for pseudogenes and a lot of the markers that they may use to build their phylogenetic trees. Yes, this evidence is preliminary, but it leads to future testable predictions on DNA function. The trajectory is clear. What the evidence suggests is genome-wide functionality, and this destroys Dr. Mays' central argument, because if we can prove that the vast majority of DNA differences are created functional DNA differences, this becomes a common design argument, as creationists have always predicted, and not an argument for universal common ancestry. If we both predict nested hierarchies, then we need to look to something else to differentiate between the models, and that is DNA function. And increasing levels of DNA function is exactly what we see.
The reason I'm bringing up the book is because how you answer that question deals with a lot of the topics that I bring up. So are all differences the result of mutation? Are some of those differences the result of created diversity? We're talking about very different processes, and it gets a much more complex discussion. We're talking about coalescence. And it's going to be difficult to not talk past each other unless we're talking about hypotheses that I'm actually proposing.
Now that we've debunked his claim on nested hierarchies on a DNA level, let's focus on his other claims. But first, we need to explain and go over what is the created heterozygosity hypothesis. Well, an important question to ask is, where does genetic diversity come from? Now, the major differences between our view as creationists and, say, somebody like Dr. Herman May's view, who holds to the position of universal common ancestry, is that we explain the vast majority of nuclear DNA differences not by mutation, as Herman May's would explain them by, but as pre-existing or created functional DNA differences. This created heterozygosity is a genetic difference between the models that has massive implications for the timing as to the origin of species. And that's what this debate is about. Those evolutionists that want to point to fossils, a bone found in the dirt, or a rock in radioisotope dating, for example, fossils, rocks, bones found in the dirt are not inherited sperm and egg. Traits are, genetics are. And that's where the battle is won. Now, if you are trying to explain the origin of species like Herman May's here just by mutations, yes, of course, you need millions of years for all these differences to accumulate. If the differences are there from the start, though, the simple operation of processes, genetic processes such as recombination and gene conversion, can produce visible variety in a single generation. This is essentially the created heterozygosity hypothesis. It makes testable predictions, and it is a hypothesis that has incredible evidence in support of.
So any coalescent time that you have for mitochondria that predicts that things go back, say, 6,000 years, you're going to have not just one, but you'll have actually a Poisson distribution of coalescent times with a big long tail like this that's older than the coalescent time for mitochondrial DNA. So all the genes, whether they're mitochondrial or nuclear, have different coalescent times. And
if you
for
assume that
mitochondrial
all
loci,
the
the
differences
coalescent
are the
time
result
is
of
much more.
mutations.
It has nothing to do with mutation at all. It has
That's
it
how
has
the
to
differences
do
are produced.
it has to do, because you're counting backwards in time, it has to do mainly with the effective population size. So just like here, I never in this example said anything about mutation, but clearly you can see the chance that if you go back one generation, if it's 4, is greater than if it's 10. So that means the time that you can trace back 2 sequences to a single coalescent is going to be more for the one with the bigger population size than with the smaller.
Oh yeah.
And that's true regardless of the mutation rate. And so that's not something you talk about. And there's a whole plethora of that's just the very, very basic undergrad version of this. And
yeah, and I agree with all that. That's
every gene is going to have every gene is going to have an independent history associated with it. And so you get all these genealogies that you're going to use to determine what the species history is, and it's going to be different. So if you trace back a mitochondrial coalescent time to 6,000 years, then that only means that there's a nuclear time that's much, much older than that waiting for it in the background. So
implicit in this theory is the fact that these differences arise via mutation, and that's a major difference between my explanation for nuclear DNA and the prevailing mainstream one. And I'm quite familiar with that.
They don't arise through mutation?
Isn't it funny how one of Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's main points in replacing Darwin has to do with created heterozygosity, and that the majority of nuclear DNA differences are actually created as functional DNA differences. Dr. Jensen also claims that although nuclear DNA differences are created, the mitochondrial DNA differences are the result of mutations. And this is why Dr. Nathaniel Jensen predicts mitochondrial DNA mutations should only go back 6,000 years to Adam and Eve. And these predictions and retrodictions have come true and continue to lead to future testable predictions. Now, it's quite obvious if you understand this model that if the nuclear DNA differences are created, and we know there are millions of them, then obviously if we were to do coalescence calculations, then it would appear those DNA differences resulted millions of years ago if they were the result of mutation. This is not what us as creationists, and specifically Dr. Nathaniel Jensen in his book Replacing Darwin claims. And what's funny is that, as you can see here, Dr. Mays used that argument in the debate numerous times as one of his main arguments that he thought proved the creation model wrong. But all it did was proved that he either just skimmed through the book or didn't read the book. I think Dr. Nathaniel Jensen puts it perfectly when he states the fact that he advanced an argument such as this posits a view of creation in conflict with 3 chapters of my book, he says. That reveals he probably didn't read it. Now, to summarize, Dr. Mays said that mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA have different coalescent times. Of course, this is standard coalescent theory. Now, this claim made by Mays only works if we assume that all mitochondrial DNA and all nuclear DNA differences are the result of mutation. Now, Replacing Darwin Chapter 7 shows clearly that the biblical base model looks to mitochondrial DNA differences in 6,000 years in a way that leads to testable and falsifiable predictions. Dr. Jensen even wanted to test some of those with Mays, and he refused. Now, if you skip to chapters 8 through 10 of Replacing Darwin, it is amazingly clear that this model explains the majority of nuclear DNA differences not by mutation, but by creation in the beginning, which leads to testable and falsifiable predictions. Dr. Mays can only attack a straw man of the biblical base model.
How would you say is my position on the origin of nuclear DNA?
The origin of nuclear DNA? Well, I think your
Nuclear
position
DNA
on the
differences.
origin of all DNA ultimately is God created it.
That's incorrect.
You don't think God created DNA?
What do you think I said in my book?
Well, you can explain it. I don't have it memorized. If I'm going to mischaracterize it, you can explain it right now. It's your chance.
That's why I want you to go through all the examples you gave. Just pick one. I want you to show me from my book. John Perry actually mentioned this last night. He's actually read what I've written, and he says he knows that one of the reasons I give for why so many people, 97% of the scientific community, disagrees with what I say. One of the things I say is I think so many people haven't read it, and I'd like to see some evidence from your slides that you've read the book. So I'd like you to pick one of the examples that you give for testing common ancestry versus separate ancestry. For the record, I actually talk, that's a whole other separate topic, but I'd like to see from my book, one of the tests you give, the falsification of common ancestry versus separate ancestry, how that separate ancestry prediction flows from what I've written. I make a lot of very specific statements, both in the book and especially in the endnotes, and I'm still waiting for you to point out one of those, and I'm disappointed you haven't been able to really give me more from the book and that directly addresses what I say. What I'd like to propose for the future is this, and we didn't really have time to discuss mitochondrial DNA. Here's a testable prediction that's in the book that we can both evaluate side by side. I think this is a pro-science way of taking the debate forward. What I say in the book is that if mitochondrial DNA differences are explicable over 6,000 years, well, the last 6,000 years, we all agree, is the history of civilization. So you should be able to see the stamp of this. The Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, Genghis Khan's empire, all of these things should be recognizable within our mitochondrial DNA differences. And Not so much if mitochondrial DNA differences represent hundreds of thousands of years of history. One of the best test cases that will distinguish between evolution and creation is the transatlantic slave trade. And we've got 2,504 individual mitochondrial DNA sequences within the 1,000 Genomes Project that's freely available. Anyone can download, anyone can do this experiment. And I'm spent 2 years on this, close to being finished. I think we have a detectable signature. So why don't we do an experiment in parallel? You can, this is your expertise. You can download this 1,000 genome sequence, make a prediction.
Nathaniel, we just talked about this. For you to say that mitochondrial diversity only goes back 6,000 years, you're saying by necessity that the coalescent of the samples of mitochondrial DNA we have today can be traced back. So they all trace back, those mitochondrial lineages trace back to one within 6,000 years.
I'm taking the challenge to them now and saying, hey, let's go out and there's a fox in the woods. I bet you I can tell you how fast his mutation rate is.
The question.
The DNA is incredibly complex, but I'm trying to get you to see a bigger picture. Comparing similar DNA between me and all other Norwegians might prove there are genetic markers that all Norwegians have and all Namibians do not have. Okay, that's probably true, but we're still human and we're still interfertile.
But that's
you don't get it. You do not get it. Humans produce humans.
The point
you don't
is,
get it.
DNA is complicated, and there's a lot we don't know, but this we do know.
Okay.
We can use neutral genetic variation to place your genome in the context of a particular population history. And the exact same methodology, using that same neutral variation, is the type of variation that I'm talking about when we look deeper into evolutionary history, differences between species or common ancestry between species and families, et cetera. It's the same technique.
I understand, heard every word, and understand. Now, so the similarities that I have with other Norwegians, even though I've never been to Norway, that same type of data you're going to use to prove that humans and grass are related if you go back far enough. Is that your
variation? Yes, and there's a reason for that, because it's the same process. It's the same process. We can look for patterns of common ancestry when we look at neutral genetic variation. Again, it's two models, and the data are only going to support. They're going to support the predictions of one model or the other. Now, I haven't heard your model necessarily make any clear predictions.
Okay, I'll make one right now. I predict humans will always produce humans. No matter what climate you go to, no matter what country you go to, no matter how far back in history you go, you will never see an example, where a human has produced a non-human or come from a non-human.
Well, I need
that's my prediction.
I need predictions that we can test without the benefit of a time machine.
Go to the hospital. Go to the maternity ward. Go to the maternity ward.
Data we have right now.
Okay.
What predictions does your model make of the data when it comes to neutral genetic variation?
My model predicts humans will produce humans, and the mutations.
That's not what I'm asking. That's not what I'm asking.
You mean that's not what you want to hear?
No, that's not the question I'm asking.
Kent, it's not the question he's asking. Actually, he's asking you what you can do now to provide experimental data that supports your hypothesis of what you're trying to put forth for the young Earth creationist position.
I go to any maternity ward and watch when the baby's born. It will be a human.
But that's consistent with the evolutionary prediction as well.
That is consistent with the idea that humans and grass have a common ancestor? Come on. You've got to be kidding.
For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button, because we are just getting started.